Ladies and gentlemen, the CEO of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, Secretary Andy Card.
Howdy, and thank you for being here. It is fabulous. Awesome, thank you. Just don't gig them too quickly. This is a real treat because we're going to hear from two people who really were able to well describe the person we're honoring today. One did it by literally working with him day after day after day, and that's Jean Becker. And she wrote a remarkable book that gives great definition to President Bush and what he did. And all of what was written was worked out by Jean Becker, working with people who actually had something to say about 41. So Jean Becker, I'm going to invite you to come out and be on stage. President Bush did something that is very unusual for a president to do. He actually allowed someone to have access to all of his diaries and to get a story that came from him. And it's a special, very special invitation to be invited to look at someone's diary and write someone's story. And we're lucky that Jon Meacham accepted the invitation and carried the burden of helping to make sure that the legacy of President Bush as he lived his life is well respected. The Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Chair at the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University. He's the biographer and contributing editor at Time, canon historian of Washington National Cathedral, previously a visiting lecturer at American Baptist College in Nashville, Tennessee, author of numerous New York Times bestsellers, John's American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House was awarded the Pulitzer-Prize for biography in 2009, and George's latest book on Lincoln is And There Was Light, spent 16 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and received numerous awards. His current book that he is here to talk us about really presents a very emotional experience for all of us because we're going to get to hear about what President Bush thought about all of us when he wrote in the diary. Jon Meacham, thank you very much for being here.
Okay, you do know they're all here to see Sully.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump right in and start because
There's a shock.
So you know what? Here's the deal, and then we're going to get serious. But so I was going to come. I thought 100 times about what to start this program with, and I was going to start by being sort of difficult. That in the book the book I wrote called The Man I Knew About Being President Bush's Chief of Staff, the story of Jon Meacham is in the chapter called The Worst of Times. And you have to read the book to figure out why. And then I was going to bring up the fact that our dear beloved departed Boyden Gray, before he could finish the book, he was writing a book called Everything Jon Meacham Forgot to Tell You. But then I decided I was going to be a kinder and gentler interviewer, mainly because I love this book, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I love this book, and I was afraid I was going to start crying talking about it until this morning, when at the Stella Hotel, standing in front with a total stranger next to us, we had this huge fight. And Jon turned to this man and said, "You have to understand, we're at the end of what's been a very long and difficult marriage."
As Henry Kissinger used to say, the truth is an absolute defense.
So when I told this poor man that we weren't even married, and then John walked away and he said, "Who are you people?" And I told him we were actually I showed him our 2 books, and I told him we were doing an event together, and he said, "I would really like to see that." But okay, I'm over my snit.
Okay.
Let's get serious.
Yes, dear.
I love this book.
Thank you.
And one of the nice things I want to say to you before we dissolve into fighting at some point is I truly believe that your book, Destiny and Power, and then with this book, you really began the renaissance of George Herbert Walker Bush. When Destiny and Power, yeah.
That is unusually kind of you. But there's a first for everything. But George Bush started the renaissance of George Bush. He always struck me as he's essentially an Eisenhower figure, right? Not getting into Eisenhower Republican versus other kinds, but that's true too. But he had more in common with, honestly, the founding fathers and Eisenhower, TR, FDR. He was interestingly a figure of an older, largely better world who governed at the beginning of an era that has not, I would argue, exactly been a marvelous run for the country in terms of our division, our treatment of each other. But you could tell, even in real time, that he was going to be like Harry Truman, that he made decisions that were politically costly in real time, but that would most likely stand the test of time. And he did. I was honored to do it, but he stood in the breach for all of us. And he was an imperfect man, but he left us a more perfect union.
And we need his voice now more than ever. Before we talk a little more specifics about the book, and I know that any minute you're probably going to bring up my book.
I was, yeah.
Yeah, you were, okay. Yeah. I did notice in the very first...
Did you do a book?
I did notice in the very first chapter of your book, you used the word character a number of times, and you also used the word character on Morning Joe this morning, so thank you. I'm happy I could inspire you.
You know, Aristotle started that, just so you know.
So, you are a historian after all, and you have some really interesting observations that I've heard you make, and I want you to make them again for this audience about the importance of celebrating our president's 100th birthdays. It's
a fascinating subtopic. I'm very big on dork jeopardy, things like that. So if you want to think about these things. So the George Washington centennial was in 1832. And Andrew Jackson very much wanted to be seen as the second Washington, the second founding father, the victory at the Battle of New Orleans seen as the ratifying triumph, really the end. If you think about it, the American Revolution was kind of a 50-year struggle, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, but always pressing toward a moment where the British would not come back. And they did come back once, right, in 1812. And so it was Jackson's capacity in 1815 to win that victory. He wanted to be seen that way. And so he embraced the Washington ethos. There's a candle that is said to have been from the tent where Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in Andrew Jackson's house. So that was kind of the first big moment there. In 1982, it was the centennial of Franklin Roosevelt, and President Reagan, who brilliantly, when you think about it, in many ways adopted, tweaked a lot of FDR's language. Right? Rendezvous with destiny was FDR's phrase, in 1936. It was not originally Ronald Reagan's. And Reagan's sense of the presidency as a stage from which you projected a reality that people might not be able to see, but that if you painted that picture, they might actually embrace it. All of that came in many ways from FDR. FDR once said to Orson Welles, "You know, Orson, you and I are the two best actors in America." And Welles said, "Yes, Mr. President, but I'm better paid." And so Reagan did that. He invited the New Dealers to the White House. They had a marvelous occasion there. And in many ways, you could see Reagan trying to signal that the kinds of Americans who had answered the call of the New Deal, he hoped would now answer the call of the Reagan Revolution. And in 1990, some of you all were probably there, Dwight Eisenhower's centennial. And President Bush gave a speech in the East Room talking about saying, you know, "I've always liked Ike." He quoted the motto that Eisenhower kept on his desk, "Gently in manner, strongly in deed." Gently in manner, strongly in deed. Very hard to imagine a better description of what George H.W. Bush did, isn't there? And of course, he had familial connections. That's the other remarkable thing. Prescott Bush, Senator Bush, was Eisenhower's favorite golfing partner in Washington, largely because Senator Bush understood that you didn't bring up business. You just talked about golf. And Eisenhower loved that. And so I think you have these moments. Anniversaries are not just about the people or the event you're commemorating. They also tell us a great deal about us and how we see ourselves at the moment. And there's not a single moment in American history I can think of, with the possible exception of the late 1850s and 1860s, where we were in more dire need of what George H.W. Bush represented than right now.
And you know, I've been thinking about this, and we both have a story we can tell about this. First of all, I just want to give a shout out to Andy Card and to his incredible staff at the foundation. This has been a great week. And probably none of the staff are in here because they're working so hard, but it's just been a great week, and watching all of you reunion and be together and enjoy each other. But I've been thinking about how President Bush really would not approve of this, because we've been talking about him for 3 days, nonstop. And I remember the first time, right before the library opened, a few months before the library opened, he was invited to walk through the library one last time, and he had a chance to make last-minute changes, minor changes. You know, we couldn't tear down any walls, but if there were some things he saw he didn't like, so he went through and he made some very minor changes. My favorite was that the color red in the China section was not the right color red. It was odd things like that. We get in the car to drive back to Houston, and he turns to me and he says, "I have a big problem with the museum." And my first thought was, and you're telling me now why? You know, that's why we did the walkthrough. And he said, "Jean, it's too much about me." Yeah. And I said, "Okay, the name on the library is the George Bush Library." Right. You do get that.
Yep.
But he thought it should be more about the team. He said, without Jean Becker, without Brent Scowcroft, without about half of the people here, there would be no George Bush Library. And he says, "What are we going to do about that?" So we put up more pictures of all of you. It's the only way we could solve it. But you have your own story of when, you know, the one I'm thinking of.
Yes, I do. Yeah. I do. Well, there are two. One was the best review, the most insightful review I've almost ever received of anything I've written was from George H.W. Bush. He wrote me about a 3-page, single-space letter about a book I wrote called Franklin and Winston, about the friendship between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. A great chunk of the letter was taken up because he was, as he put it, pissed off. And he said, you know, "Forgive me, but that's what I am," because Mrs. Pierce had stolen, in his view, a wedding gift, a cocktail tray that he and Mrs. Bush had been given for their wedding in 1945 that he always wanted. He liked this cocktail tray. And I had described one similar to it in the Roosevelt White House. And so for about, I don't know, 200, 250 words, he was really still mad at his mother-in-law for stealing. This was in 2004, so he was still irritated. But one of the criticisms of the book was, I think you focus too much on Roosevelt and Churchill. I said, well, thank you, sir. He said, I can't imagine making the decisions I made without Colin Powell and without, it was the same instinct. But I took the occasion to read a draft of the eulogy I was honored to deliver for the president to him in the summer of 18, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It would have been the summer of 18, and I read it to him. Very interesting, right? So before we canonize St. George of College Station, the eyes were very attentive. He was listening to every possible bit of this, let's be clear. I got to the end, and he said, that's great. He said, awful lot about me. So, this is your last shot, sir. You know, this is it. But it was not affected, right? I mean, it's complicated. Let's be very clear. We are in a George Bush presidential library. This is a man who believed in service, but he didn't open a soup kitchen. Right? He sought ultimate power in a nuclear age. He ran again and again and again, far more than actually the current political climate really allows you to, when you think about it. He wanted to serve, yes, but he also wanted, in a very subtle and decent way, he wanted to bend the arc of history in the direction he thought it should go. And that, as he said to me, was, it takes a lot of guts, it takes a lot of ego to say, hey, what about me? In a country this size. So let's not, I don't want to put him on too high a pedestal, because I think the higher...
No, in front of this crowd, it's okay.
Well, but it's not. This is important, right? Because if we overly canonize him, he loses his capacity to teach. If we acknowledge that he was flawed and fallible and could screw things up, that's somebody, I don't know about y'all, but I certainly screw up a lot of things. And I am much more likely to learn from a sinner than a saint, because I'm a sinner.
I really hate when you're right.
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
I do.
I know. You all know basically that, I don't know how many Buddhists there are in the room, but the basic reincarnation theory, because Becker has become this odd combination of Barbara Bush and George H.W. Bush. She's very mean, but then forgets what the predicate is. Right? You sort of start and then kind of wander off.
I'm going to slap you. And, it's being live streamed and there's press back there, but we might make more news.
This is all true.
It's all true. I'm going to tell a funny story about you. I don't know if it's a funny story about you or me, actually. So John, when Destiny and Power is out, and he told the first part of the story at a lunch earlier for the donors. If you were not at that lunch, it means you didn't give enough money. Anyway, he told the story. President Bush did not like listening to audiobooks. He was a big reader, but when he really couldn't read anymore, he didn't like audiobooks. He liked for authors to come read their books to him. And because he was a former president of the United States and beloved, we did pretty good on getting authors to come read their books to him. Or the staff would, the family, a lot of the grandkids would read to him. Evan Cicely, his last aide, read a lot to him. But John came and read a chapter of Destiny and Power to him. And John made the comment to me that when you left Walker's Point, you said, I would really like to read the last chapter to him. When you're getting close to the end of the book, let me know, and I'll come back, because I would like to finish the book, be the one to finish Destiny and Power with him. In the meantime, I had a great conversation with Barbara Bush about her funeral. She really had not finished planning her funeral, and one of the things
There's a category, a great conversation about your funeral.
Have I interrupted
Sorry,
you?
sorry,
Yeah.
dear.
Okay. So we had to talk about her funeral, and she needed to pick her eulogist, for example, and she wanted Susan Baker, Jeb, and you, which I thought was odd, and so she asked me to call her eulogist, and so I called all of them, and you were very touched that she wanted you to be a eulogist. Well, Evan came into my office, I don't know, a month or so later, and he said, yeah, we're almost done with Destiny and Power. If Meacham wants to come finish this book, he needs to come like the end of this week or next week. Well, I'm a very busy woman. I'm multitasking. So I think I'm on the conference call, and I email him, and the subject line is, "The end is near." John calls me, and he says, "What the hell happened?" He said, "You're kidding. The end is near?" And I said, "Well, Evan's been reading to him every day, and yeah, they're almost done with the book." And John says, "What the hell are you talking about?" I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" Well, he thought, of course, Mrs. Bush was near death.
Yeah, the end is near, right?
The end is near. Okay, that's a bad story on me. I just changed my mind. You're right.
No.
Why did you write the book? What inspired you?
This?
You did Destiny and Power. What inspired you to do this book?
What inspired me to do it was Mary Finch. Where's Mary? Who was marvelous at helping to provide the images. I think this might be the first thing that has used the scrapbooks, Mrs. Bush's scrapbooks, in a significant way. And I loved, there are two books this is a tradition of. I loved a book that Joe Alsop did about FDR's centennial, and a book that our friend Michael Beschloss did about the Eisenhower centennial. And there's, again, I think there are these moments where essays can almost tell you more than longer projects. For those of you who teach, you know that if you're walking into a class, you better know what you're going to say, right? You have to, because students will tell you pretty quickly with their eyes that if you're not making sense. A project like this forces a certain clarity. And I was thinking, what does George H.W. Bush mean right now? And what he means, the easy answer, right, is in this climate, here's this decent, gentlemanly figure who represented a long ago order. All true. But it was 20 minutes ago. It's not impossible to recover if we summon the same reserves of, to use a word my soon-to-be former wife used, reserves of character. Because character, as the Greeks taught us, is destiny. And it's not just the leaders. In a democracy, it's the led. A democracy is the fullest manifestation of our habits of heart and mind. That's what this experiment is about. We haven't been invaded by aliens. If people don't like cable news or don't like social media, turn it off and don't tweet. It's not that complicated. And so it's sort of here I am ranting about get off my lawn and all that. But I mean it. I mean it. It's as if somehow or another we've outsourced our destiny. That's not what Americans do. That's not what democracy, that's not why, I just got back from Normandy. That's not why they stormed the beach. That's not why George Herbert Walker Bush on the 2nd of September, 1944, the most important Saturday of his life, is shot down. The day that he thought about the rest of his life, why me, why was I spared? This book is dedicated both to Barbara Pierce Bush and to Del Delaney and Ted White, the two crewmates he lost in Operation Baker over the Bonin Islands. But this was, they're slipping away. And it's hard, but guess what? It was hard then. Let's not overly romanticize the past in a way that prevents us from rising to the occasion. To me, what President Bush represents is a man who was driven by ambition, but who, when everything mattered, put service above self. And if you don't have the first part, the second part isn't all that interesting, right? If we're presenting him as this Olympian figure, then that's great, but I don't know a lot of people on Olympus. Maybe y'all do. You knew one, and it was George Herbert Walker Bush. But he was mortal. And because he got to a place where he listened to the better angels of his nature, just enough of the time to be a transformative figure, means we can too. So that's why.
I may be reading too much into this, but I can tell that you're just dying to ask me about character matters.
I am.
Okay, good.
I am.
Because there's something I want to read from the book. I want to get his voice into this conversation. And I hate to ask you this.
Yes?
I need you to hold, wait, see if I can bounce this.
You want me to enable you to speak more loudly?
No, I want you to hold my microphone until I find the passage.
Talk about a sacrifice. Here we go.
No, I think, oh, you don't have to pick that up.
I'll be happy to. I can't do all, this is like the time when, remember when Bush shook the hand of the department store mannequin in New Hampshire and asked him for a vote, you know. Mrs. Bush said to George, that was a mannequin. He said, never know, gotta ask. I am very big in assisted living facilities. Y'all should see me. They watch Murder, She Wrote. They asked me to come speak. It's great.
The power of this book is that it was written by 157 people. There's 157 essays in this book. If you have an essay in this book, I would love for you to stand up. See, and there's a number of you here who I'm constantly told that yours is their favorite essay, but I can't name names because it'll hurt the rest of your feelings. Andy Card and Joe Strauss. Anyway, I thought but President Bush's voice is also in this book. There's an entire chapter. Most of the book is essays from the people who knew him best. But I want to read to you his address to the nation given after he lost the election in 1992 to Bill Clinton. This was his radio address, November 7th, 1992. Way back in 1945, Winston Churchill was defeated at the polls. He said, "I have been given the Order of the Boot. That is the exact same position in which I find myself today. I admit this is not the position I would have preferred, but it is a judgment I honor. Having known the sweet taste of popular favor, I can more readily accept the sour taste of defeat, because it is seasoned for me by my deep devotion to the political system under which this nation has thrived for 2 centuries. Ours is a nation that has shed the blood of war and cried the tears of depression. We have stretched the limits of human imagination and seen the technologically miraculous become almost mundane. As always, our advantage has been our spirit, a constant confidence, a sense that in America, the only things not yet accomplished are the things that have not yet been tried. President-elect Clinton needs all Americans to unite behind him so he can move our nation forward. But more than that, he will need to draw upon this unique American spirit. There are no magic outside solutions to our problems. The real answers lie within us. We need more than a philosophy of entitlement. We need to all pitch in, lend a hand, and do our part to help forge a brighter future for this country. On January 20th, Barbara and I will head back to Texas. For us, there will be no more elections, no more politics. Yeah, that didn't work out. But we will rededicate ourselves to serving others because, after all, that is the secret of this unique American experience, this unique American spirit. With this spirit, we can realize the golden opportunities before us and make sure that our new day, like every American day, is filled with hope and promise. We need his voice more than ever. We do. And you know, I get asked a lot, where is the next George Bush? And people can be really pessimistic about this, and I think that's a big mistake. His address to the nation was very optimistic. I see a couple of grandkids here in the audience. You're the future. I'm looking at you, this row right over here. He has 17 amazing grandchildren who have their grandfather's heart. They have the heart of a servant. And there are some people who are here today, and they know who they are, I've called you George Bush Jr. for years, Joe Strauss. And also Rob Portman, one of my big heroes. I'm sorry to call you out. But people who think there are no more George Bushes, yeah, there are. And like John, I'm just going to get a little preachy. You just have to vote for them. You know, you all control this. Quit voting for people who don't have character. Quit voting for people who are not worthy of your vote. The people are out here, and they're willing to serve, and we just need to follow his example of do what's right for the country. Not what's right for you, not what's right for the party, but what's right for the country. And I really didn't mean to get preachy, but that was sort of fun.
Well, you should. It's a season where preaching is not a bad thing. There's a great line in Tom Sawyer where Twain talks about an evangelist who came to town, and he writes, the evangelist was so good that even Huck Finn was saved until Tuesday. You know, so that's all we have to do is get through Tuesday. You've done 2 books in fairly rapid succession. What did you think you needed to say beyond the memoir? Why this book?
Well, I wrote The Man I Knew because President Bush left me so many great stories. I mean, being his chief of staff for 25 years was a wild and crazy ride. As I said in that book, I was never bored. Mikhail Gorbachev once told me to shut up, and I'm oddly proud of that. And Tom Selleck once kissed me. Yeah, I can hear you women. You're jealous, I know. But so I did check with the Bush family.
Let's go back to that for a second.
Oh, yes? What would you like to know?
Gorbachev kissed you?
No, Gorbachev told me to shut up.
Oh.
Tom Selleck kissed me on this cheek.
Okay. And Chuck Norris?
No.
Okay.
He hugged me once. Okay, no, we're not.
Sorry.
I'm in the middle of something.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Very important.
So I asked the 5 Bush kids because I didn't want to write the book, honestly, without their permission, because I've been their dad's chief of staff for 25 years, and they were extremely supportive. And I'm very grateful to Governor Bush, who's always the designated, he's one of my proofreaders of my books, and he's always very helpful and has great insights. So Character Matters was not my idea. I was having lunch with my editor in New York, pitching another book, which Tom Collimore and I are writing together about the behind the scenes of Advance, what happens on the road, or even what happens it's going to be a very fun book about what happens behind the scenes before the president comes out and gives a statement. And there's about 100 people here who need to go home and start writing as soon as this week is over. But my editor looked at me and he said, I love that idea, and absolutely yes, we want you to sign a contract for that book, but I want you to write another book first. I don't think we're done with George Herbert Walker Bush. And I confess I looked at him and I said, You do remember he died at the end of the last book. But he felt, my editor, Sean Desmond, felt there was a lot more to be learned from him. And he says, I just think we can learn a lot from how he led his life and what kind of president he was. And I said, well, let me give it a try. So I did a call out for essays, and you saw the result. Mm-hmm. I mean, people, I don't really know who they are in essays. I'm like, who are you? But it was an honor to put the book together. Yeah. And after, I would love for you to, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do want to tell a great story. I think we both should tell our favorite George Bush story.
Go for it.
Should I go for it?
Yes, sir.
Want me to go first?
Go for it.
Okay. This story is actually not in the book. It's in The Man I Knew, but I think there's at least 8 people here who've not heard this story, so I'm going to tell it right now. Again, I think I learn from him almost every day. So what a lot of people don't know, people in Texas know this, but after Hurricane Katrina came to New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast in August 2005, about a week later, another hurricane came ashore called Hurricane Rita. And Hurricane Rita pretty well chewed up what was left of the Louisiana coastline. And it was a horrible storm, and those poor people were not getting any attention because everybody is in New Orleans. I mean, Katrina was an overwhelming Category 5 hurricane. So this wonderful man named Richard Schluschlag, who was supposed to be here this week, and he died last week. He's a big hero of mine. But Richard Schluschlag cold called the office, and he said that the town of Cameron, Louisiana had almost been leveled by Hurricane Rita, and they couldn't get any help and couldn't get any attention. And I mean, everybody was to the nonprofits, FEMA, everybody's just overwhelmed by these back-to-back hurricanes. And he said to me, and I then told President Bush, that if only they could get health care to come back, then people could start rebuilding, but the hospital had been leveled, and he wanted President Bush to raise money to build an emergency room. Well, Richard was a very smart man. He knew that President Bush had a soft place in his heart for Cameron, Louisiana, because when he was in the oil business, all of his offshore oil rigs were off the coast of Cameron, and Cameron is where he went when he needed to helicopter out to visit his oil rig. So President Bush said, of course, and we raised $3 million, and we're going to Cameron. It's actually the next year, the week before Christmas, with a $3 million check, and we're going to break ground for the new emergency room. And it was going to be, the governor was coming, and the high school marching band. It was going to be a lovely event. And President Bush looked at the schedule, and he looked at me, and he said, this is a really boring schedule. And quite frankly, it hurt my feelings. And I said, I think a former president coming to town with $3 million is pretty damn exciting. And he said, I have an idea. The scariest words he ever said to me. He said, Jean, Barr and I have fallen in love with this TV show. We watch it every night. It's called ER. And there's this young actor on it, good-looking guy, and I think he's a star. His name is George Clooney. He said, why don't we invite George Clooney to go to Cameron, Louisiana with us? He said, ER, ER. Do you get it, Jean? Well, here's what he didn't get. ER is no longer on TV. They're watching it in reruns on TBS. He's one of the smartest people I knew, but you try to explain reruns to a former president. I said, sir, ER is not on TV anymore. And he goes, every night. George Clooney is making all those ocean movies, and he's the sexiest man alive, according to People magazine. And I said, you know what? George Clooney's not coming. We don't know him. We don't know anyone who knows him. His politics are a little bit to the left of yours. George Clooney is not coming to Cameron, Louisiana with you the week before Christmas. And it's possible I sort of stormed out of his office. Well, 2 minutes later, he comes in my office, and he had another idea. And before I tell you what it is, I would like for you to show the picture, my wonderful audio-visual man. Yes, that would be the two of them in Cameron, Louisiana. George Clooney. So here's the deal, and a lot of you know who this is. Guess who was the producer of all the ocean movies? Jerry Weintraub. And a great friend of President Bush's. He had a house in Kennebunkport, and President Bush could Google with the best of them. And he says, I Googled those ocean things you talked about. He said, did you know that Jerry Weintraub, and he produced the movies, and anyway, he called Jerry Weintraub, who called Clooney, are they not the cutest things you've ever seen? And George Clooney came. And on the plane coming home, did I go with them? Yes, of course I did, yeah.
Did you tell him about Selleck?
There was an incident. So everybody on the plane fell asleep, but George and me coming home. And I got up to use the powder room. And when I came out, George was standing in the galley, and we had to squeeze by each other. And I think he did it on purpose. I think it's just, I have no proof, but I want to live with that dream the rest of my life. And I do think one of the reasons why I was so upset when Richard Suslag died, he was a great man, but if it weren't for him, I would have never met George. Anyway, I asked Clooney why he came, and he said it's because it so touched him that President Bush was trying to help a town that no one had heard of, that had been destroyed by a storm that no one had heard of, and he said, I wanted to be a part of it. And I love that George Clooney got him so quickly. But it was a great life lesson. George, he was the biggest thinker any of us ever knew. I did the high school marching band. He did George Clooney. And but it was a great life lesson, and we did have to squeeze by each other. Okay, your favorite George Bush story.
I really can't match brushing up against George Clooney. And we're in Texas, so even if I did, I couldn't tell you. That was fun. That was fun.
Yeah. Has anyone ever kissed you because of George Bush?
Kissed me because of George Bush? I don't think so.
No, okay.
Let's leave that aside. This is all right. Shifting gears, because I just saw an image of it, and when it pops back up, this is about who he was and who we should be. Krakow, Poland. Vice President Bush goes to a children's leukemia ward. He's talking. This is in his diary. It's actually I've had very few moments. I don't cry easily. I couldn't be a Bush. I have actually. I control my tear ducts. I cried when I dropped my son off at first grade. I cried recently when I dropped my daughter off at college, and I cried reading this in the Vice Presidential Diary, which this was 85. And it's interesting, just for the dorks in the room, which is if you're here, you're a dork. In the vice presidential years, he kept marvelous diaries in oddly numbered years because otherwise he was on the campaign trail so much. So 81 is great, 82 almost nothing, 83 great, 84 nothing, 85 great, 87, etc. So he's in Poland, Children's Leukemia Ward, and I wept when I read this in the diary. I don't think, this is part of the advanced person thing too, I don't think he'd read his brief. I think the way he describes the moment is he was surprised by this. He's standing over the bed of a young boy who was sick with the illness that had taken Robin 32 years before. And the photo dogs, as he called them, were all behind him. TV and still photographers. And he starts to cry, the vice president. And he's talking to himself into the diary. He says, I couldn't turn around. I couldn't turn around with tears in my eyes because then the story would have been about me. And so I stood over this little guy, knowing he didn't know why I was crying, but hoping he knew that I loved him. That's the man we honor. That's the man we were blessed to have lead the country. And I think those are the values we have to try to live by.
Wait. Any discussion of George Herbert Walker Bush has to include Barbara Pierce Bush. And he would be the first to say, if he were here, that there would be no George Bush without her. And one of my, you want to say something? Okay.
Yes, but go ahead.
Okay. One of my favorite essays in Character Matters was written by one of her former aides, Kara Sanders, who couldn't come this week, unfortunately. But she's helping with the phones at the office. This is post-presidency. She's helping with the phones at the office. And I wish I knew what was going on in the world, but Colin Powell called, and before she could put him through to President Bush, Secretary James Becker called. And before she could deal with that, the governor of Texas called, whose name was, George W. Bush. And she was about ready to run, she had all three of them on hold, and she was about ready to run into his office to say, okay, Colin Powell, James Baker, the governor, who do you want to talk to first?
And there's one parachute.
Yeah.
And a rabbi.
And then sure enough,
George W. Bush, Colin Powell, and Jim Baker walk into a bar.
okay, this is a serious story.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so just sit there. Okay, before Kara could deal with this trifecta, we only had 4 lines in the office, and sure enough, the 4th one rings, and it's Barbara Bush. Puts her on, yeah, you see this coming, so puts her on hold. Kara runs into his office and says, sir, Colin Powell, James Baker, Governor Bush, your wife, who do you want to talk to first? He's the smartest man in America. Put Barbara through until the other 3 all call him back. I think this is a lesson you probably could learn.
I could.
You could, yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
but
the end is near.
I just wanted to share, first of all, I do love that story because it just says so much about the role she played in his life and how smart he was. And I hate this clock in front of us. We have 5 minutes and 36 seconds left.
I think that's
so
more than
we just
enough.
had to include a Now, you know what? Don't laugh at him. See, you all aren't helping because he says something like that. If you didn't laugh, then he would say, oh, this isn't my crowd. But okay, go ahead. What did you want to say?
If I lose this crowd, I'm done. So I'm a biographer. One of the things biographers need to know is when their subjects were born. Write that down, students. In closing Destiny and Power, I came up to, actually it's remarkable, there are 2 parts to this. I came to Maine to get Mrs. Bush's permission. She did something really remarkable. I mean, and Andy mentioned it. Really remarkable that President Bush let me read his diary. Even more remarkable was that Barbara Bush let me read her diary.
I was completely opposed to it.
Well, thank God you were overruled.
Yeah.
Riveting historical document. Imagine putting a smart, observant, perceptive woman at the highest levels of global power from 1948 until 2018 with a diligent work ethic to write down what she saw and what she thought. It's an amazing document. And
which may never be open to the public.
There are some folks I'm looking at that don't want it open to the public, including me. But so, and this doesn't, what I'm about to tell you just doesn't happen. The only condition on the entire project for me was Mrs. Bush said, you can read the diary, you can use what you want, but I want to see anything you quote directly. She said not to change it, but I might take something, I might say you can't use that. And I agreed to that. I took her, I think it was 48 pages of excerpts. And I went up, and it was June 12th, 2015. And I remember, because I was surprised to learn that it was George Herbert Walker Bush's birthday, I had just written 1,000 pages about him.
And you didn't know it was his birthday?
That day I didn't. I knew
Well,
what day it was.
and then
Notionally, I knew, but...
then you wonder why I sometimes have issues with you.
I know.
How could you not know that? Okay,
I agree.
go ahead.
I agree.
All right.
Where's Sandy Ellis? Sandy's here. Maybe.
Who are you looking for?
Sandy
Sandy who?
Ellis. No. So his Nancy Bush Ellis. I was talking to.
Are you looking for Hap Ellis?
Hap. I'm sorry.
Thank God I'm here.
Oh, Hap.
For you.
I'm sorry. Why am I
Sandy Ellis is dead. That was Nancy Ellis's
But
husband,
those were my
Hap's
people.
father. Okay, Hap. You were looking
Sorry.
for Hap.
I'm sorry.
He's right there.
Hap.
Okay.
So I was at lunch. I was on the phone with Mrs. Ellis in that period, and she said, "Well, how long is this, dearie?" And I said, "Well, it's about 1,000 pages." She said, "I wouldn't read 1,000 pages about pop." So I had to cut it. But I took it this. Mrs. Bush read everything and took nothing off the record. That just doesn't happen, right? She said, "You can use all of that." We then go out to lunch, which I now realize is a birthday lunch for my subject. Genius. And the conversation turns to the war. And Mrs. Bush says, and she as she did sometimes, I'm sure everyone heard it, in private, she sometimes slipped, and it was Pop again, it wasn't George. She said, "Pop, you had to have been saved for a reason. I know you were saved for a reason." And he looked up with that big left hand, he said, You were the reason. And then he turned and said, "Mr. Smooth."
I loved your eulogy of him was incredible. And John's whole eulogy sort of is asking that question that President Bush spent his whole life wondering, why me? Why was I spared? And you answer it so eloquently in your eulogy. And will you hold this for a minute?
Sure. Yes, dear. Mr. Smooth.
I have something to say. You have to hold it up.
Yes,
Thank you, dear. I'm going to ask John, do you mind? I put your entire eulogy in this book, and I'm going to ask you to read your ending.
Oh, sure.
Because it's really perfect. It is perfect.
I love that Greenwich Country Day School uniform. Isn't that great? That was the athletic uniform.
I want you to start right there. Do you want me to hold the, here.
Just tell me where you want. Oh,
I want you to start, can I give you my glasses? So again, I'll just repeat that John's, most of his eulogy is just asking that question. And I would love for you to read this paragraph, that one.
Okay.
And then about the, okay. The creeds.
Oh.
Okay.
His tongue may have run amuck at times, but his heart was steadfast. His life code, as he said in a letter to his mother, was, "Tell the truth. Don't blame people. Be strong. Do your best. Try hard. Forgive. Stay the course." It was and is the most American of creeds. Abraham Lincoln's Better Angels of Our Nature and George H.W. Bush's Thousand Points of Light are companion verses in America's national hymn. For Lincoln and Bush both called on us to choose the right over the convenient, to hope rather than to fear, to heed not our worst impulses, but our best instincts. And so, as we commend his soul to God, we ask, as he so often did, why him? Why was he spared? The workings of providence are mysterious, but this much is clear. The George Herbert Walker Bush, who survived that fiery fall into the waters of the Pacific, made our lives and the lives of nations freer, better, warmer, nobler. That was his mission. That was his heartbeat. And if we listen closely enough, we can hear that heartbeat even now, for it is the heartbeat of a lion who not only led us, but who loved us. That's why him. That's why he was spared.
That's the perfect ending.
Well,
They deserve a standing O.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Sully is standing too.
Sully is coming out, and you know exactly what I'm going to ask you to do, Valerie. No, don't. Here. Yes. Sully, this is your boring audience. Okay, I do have an embarrassing story to tell you. Why am I telling you this? I barely know you people. But when President Bush died, we weren't sure. His next assignment was Walter Reed Hospital. And Evan Sisley, President Bush's last aide, came to me and said, everybody who takes care of Sully is going to DC for the funeral. Who's going to take care of Sully while we're in DC? So it's one of the best ideas I had that week. I said, why don't we just take Sully with us? I said, he's going to Walter Reed. Let me get permission to take him on Air Force One with us. And so I called my Department of Defense point of contact, and he said, let me make a phone call, but I think that's a great idea. He called me back, and he said, we would be honored for Sully to fly on Air Force One, President Bush's service dog, to report to duty for Walter Reed. I think we turned him over to you, Valerie. So for some reason, I'm the one who escorted Sully off Air Force One. Everybody else thought they had something else to do. I was a little nervous about it. And I'm walking Sully across the tarmac when my site person at Andrews Air Force Base came running up to me and said, Jean, the press wanted me to ask you. And for a moment I thought, oh gosh, they want me to do an interview. They want a quote from me. And I'm thinking, ugh. And then she says, you're standing between the cameras and Sully. Would you mind putting Sully on your other side and get out of the photo if possible? It was a humbling moment, but this dog is the most popular dog in America. We're very grateful to Valerie for taking such good care of him.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just had a remarkable experience. Tell your children and grandchildren. God bless you, and thank you, Jean Becker and Jon Meacham. And they'll be signing books outside. Thank you very much.